We're here in the Song of Songs pursuing Christ. How long have you been pursuing Christ? How far have you let him go in your life, or how far have I let him go? How much am I following him? How much do I resist him? Well, the book of the Song of Songs is receiving of Christ and then giving back to him. The maiden began with nothing, just a maiden in a vineyard. Now she's his bride. And that takes a lot to become the bride of Christ. So we're in chapter 8, and she's mature. She's gone through all these chapters, and now she's attained something. She matches Christ. She pleases Christ. But when we get to chapter 8, these first few verses seem that there's the bride actually started speaking in chapter 7, verse 10. But when we get to these verses here in chapter 8, is this speaking a deeper desire that she has for him, or is it a struggle? She's mature, she's full of light, but yet when you read these verses, you sense she's conscious of a lack. Because in this verse, she confesses her need for instruction. You read in verse, I'll read part of the verse, chapter 8, verse 2. It says, I would lead you. So she's strong to tell her beloved, I want to lead you. I want to bring you into my mother's house who would instruct me. So she uses the word instruction. So this could indicate a lack. So there's a deep desire in her, as in you and as in me, to have a relationship with Christ without any limitation, without any hindrance, and without any delay. And then also in these verses, you can say that she realizes that her union with Christ is still not yet complete. And we covered some of this when we were in verse 1. In verse 1, she said she wished him to be as a brother. And I don't know if this is the highest revelation of Christ as a brother, but her intention to call her bridegroom as a brother is that when you're with a family, publicly or openly, pretty much you can be free with them. And so she says, I wish you were my brother, so then when we were in public, I could kiss you. And I wouldn't have any shame or any contempt from others. So she felt there was a lack here. She couldn't be with him the way she wanted to, and this became a hindrance or a limitation to the fullness of love, because she just wants to minister to him with a constant embrace, a constant love, laying hold upon him in every place and at every time, and no disturbance to this kind of relationship from others or their opinions, their judgments upon her. So when you read this section of the song, or you consider this song as you're writing it, the verses form a desire, a strong desire, or a strong anticipation. This is actually the hope of the bride, rather than her present experience. Her present experience, there's a rich fellowship between her and the beloved Christ. There's a love, but yet she anticipates something more. And as lovers of Christ, you and I, we all know what it is to have an earnest spiritual desire after him, and we have deep longings are just a continual part of our seeking after him. We wake up in the morning, we long after him. During the day, we desire him. There's desire, there's longing, and there's hope, but yet we have not reached what we desire. We haven't brought it yet into our experience. So we haven't entered into it with full satisfaction. So you look at some of the phrases that she uses in verse 1 and 2 as she directs them towards the beloved Christ. She says, if you would be as my brother. So she says would be. That means it doesn't happen yet. I would kiss you. And then I should not be despised. I would lead you. In verse 2, she says, I would bring you, would instruct me. She would be instructed. I would cause you to drink. She just, in these verses, the one striking feature or what comes forth is her anticipation. Something has not yet, she hasn't presently realized something or experienced something, but yet this hope that she has produces purity. And it's the same thing with us. When we have hope, we're focused on Christ alone, and we pass, as we're passing through this earthly journey, our hope is not earthly, but it's Christly. It's on Christ. And it would be as 1 John 3:3 says, everyone who has this hope within them to be like Christ purifies themselves even as he is pure. You know, as lovers of Christ, we just realize, what do we realize? There's a vast territory of fellowship and union with Christ that we still need to enter into. We still need to take possession and gain as ours. Even you look in Philippians, the mature Apostle Paul in Philippians 3:8 and 10. Paul was filled with Christ, but then he says in Philippians, he says, I might gain Christ. Paul, don't you have a fullness of Christ wherever you go? But he says, I want to gain him, because even the mature apostle knew there was more of Christ. And then he says in verse 10, to know him. Paul, don't you know him? He would say, yes, I do, but I don't, there's still more to know. So there's many mature lovers, you know, that one thing about a lover of Christ is that we always want more of him. And when you look in 1 Corinthians 2:8 and 9, these verses tell us that something has been predetermined and hidden, and it's a mystery. And what is it? Eye has not seen it, ear has not heard, and it hasn't come up as a thought in our heart how much God has prepared. But then listen to this phrase, how much God has prepared for those who love him. You know, lovers of Christ, as you are and as I am, have a bright future. Things are hopeful for the bride because she is so much in love with Christ. Love just brings into our heart, brings us into his heart, brings his heart into our heart, and brings us into the eternal blessings of God. And this love is just leading us into Christ. So in chapter 8, verse 2, the bride's desire is to lead Christ, to bring Christ, to be instructed by Christ and with Christ, and then just causing the beloved Christ to drink. So she says, I would lead you. What is this leading? This is to guide. She took the lead in service in the field and in the vineyard. You remember in chapter 7, verses 11 and 12, she says to him, let us. 4 times she says this. Now she wants to lead Christ. Now, you think about this. Can we, as lovers, as believers, lead Christ? It seems when you read through the Gospels, the one thing Christ speaks a lot, our beloved Christ speaks a lot, is follow me. So that means he's taking the lead and we're following. But in this verse, she says, I would lead you. So what is this? This means she is so familiar with him. It's not that she's considering him low and she needs to lead him. No, she's treating him actually as the majestic one, and she would lead him as a majestic person. A great person is being led in a procession. And this would be like in Isaiah 60, verse 11, there's the phrase, kings may be led. So he is the king, and she's the bridal queen, leading him where? Into love. Her leading him brings her as a rich entrance into his eternal kingdom. So our fellowship with him of life and love is a leading. In the past, when you considered Christ was constrained by her. So in chapter 4, he said to her, to the bride, you have ravished my heart, my sister. my spouse with one of your eyes. This is our song of love with Christ, to satisfy him. And then in chapter 6, verse 5, he says to her, turn away your eyes, for they have overcome me. Isn't this such a high state of love? Now she says to him, I would lead you. So this is her anticipation of being brought into perfect love. And then she says, not only would I lead you, but I would bring you. So again, she wants to carry him as in a procession. And this is just her strong, the exercise of her strong faith. It's a prayer of faith, bring you for further intimate fellowship and union with the beloved Christ. And like James 5:16 says, the supplication of a righteous person avails much. So she says, I would bring you. And when you get to these latter chapters of the song, it's many times good to go back and see how we came here. How did our love for Christ deepen? How have we come to this point of maturity? Or how are we still desiring to be mature? So there's similar thoughts of I would bring you. Chapter 1, verse 4, it says, the king has brought me into his chamber. So in this verse, she wants to bring him, but in chapter 1, verse 4, it's the king bringing the maiden into his chambers. In the early stages of our loving pursuit of Christ, we have nothing. It seems like our life is still without direction, a chaos. We don't know which way to turn. So now he, in his love, brings her. And this is just a mercy. Christ takes us as his lovers into his chambers. And what is his chambers? It's the place where our eyes can be opened, our heart can be unveiled to see his beauty. It's a place of revelation. So she begins to have revelation when he brings her to recognize the unveiled face of the glory of the King. And this is his doing. It's by his love, it's by his grace, it's not by my striving. His lover is brought into an intimate nearness in the secret place where she can begin to behold the treasures of himself. And then in chapter 2, verse 4, it says, again, he brought me to the banqueting house. So again, by his love, by his grace, he brings his lover into his house of wine. So she's with him now, not only seeing him, but dwelling with him to drink and to eat of himself. She begins to absorb him, take him in. She's led away from worldly enjoyments into the experience of him as her joy. It's a cheerful experience of his joyful fullness. And the first two bringings, chapter 1, verse 4, and chapter 2, verse 4, are his bringing. It's his doing. Then in chapter 3, verse 4, there was some kind of discrepancy between them. Not on his part, but on her part. And so he left, and she was alone. So she sought him, and then she comes in chapter 3, verse 4, she says, I found him. I held him. And then this is the phrase, I brought him into my mother's house. So she seized him, captured him, carried him into the place where the whole process of intimate union with him began. So after losing his presence, she would never let this happen again. And this was just a big expression of love. And maybe, and possibly, there's just a big mixture here. There's a mixture of herself, of her strength, her natural strength, to bring Christ in. She doesn't know his desire that much, but she just loves him, so she brings him. But the beloved Christ doesn't rebuke her, but he lets her bring him where she's at. Now, how often this is with our experience, we often bring Christ where we are, even in our immaturity, and how loving and kind he is to us to be there with us. So she says, I would bring you. And it's just an amazing the beloved Christ, the divine one, with the perfect humanity, would allow such a longing in us. And this could be similar to Jacob in Genesis 32, 26. It says that Jacob held God and would not let him go until he was blessed to know his name. So in her maturity of life and love, she knows his heart, she knows his intentions, she knows what satisfies him. Selfish ambition has been put away. There's no self in her intention. She only wants him. But she wants to bring him more fully into a perfect love union. And then she says, where will she bring him? Into my mother's house. And so this is into the bride's home, the dwelling place of her female parent. And this is where the bond of the family is, the mother's house, the mother, and the source of her existence and favor. In chapter 3, verse 4, she brought him into the mother's house. But this was in disobedience. By living in the self, she lost his presence. And so when she found him, she brought him into the place where her initial spiritual experience and blessing with him began. So this my mother's house, what is this? And what is this place? Actually, it's the place of the promised Spirit. It's the place of God's administration or economy of grace. It's the place of divine birth, of a new beginning of life. It's the place where the flesh ceases to be dominant and she has nothing to do with the flesh. So my mother's house, you can look in Galatians 4:26 through 30, and it says, our mother is the Jerusalem above, which is our source of grace. So the bride's life of faith connected with the operation of grace, just producing bridal features in her for his pleasure. So she would bring the beloved Christ back to this place, or to this place where the divine birth transpired, where the promised Spirit was received, where she can have continual revelations of Christ, and she could be guided into him as all her reality. And so this is where grace operated in her to change her to be his match. Grace's work transformed her to display him in beauty, affections, and glory. And now she has just a sense that all is of grace, all is of the Spirit, from the beginning to the end. So she just wants to dwell with him in this place of blessing. So this house, the Spirit and grace fill this house. Our striving after Christ without grace, without the Spirit, just is a slavery. But his grace came, his Spirit came, and there was a freedom from every struggle, every hindrance was taken away, that we can live in perfect union with him in grace. The law was given by Moses, but grace came through Jesus Christ. So what is this house? In Hebrews 3:6 it says, we are this house. So we become, she says, I would bring you into my mother, the place for the beloved to rest. And then Ephesians 3:17 talks about the house. Our heart is the house where the beloved Christ can make his home. The house is for him. The house belongs to him. So she wants to bring him more and more into her heart. And the house also, like it says in 1 Timothy 3:16, it's a corporate dwelling place of God. It's the house of the living God. Mother's house, the house of the living God. It's the house of the family of faith, it says in Galatians 6:10. So the lovers of Christ throughout time and in different places, this corporate bride, are a bridal house for Christ the King, so that we can dwell with him eternally together. So can you see can you feel, or I don't know what you would call it, the anticipation she has in this verse? She's so mature, but she's so longing after more. The bride is just deeply longing for him. Something further of love needs to be gained. So on one hand, she's a person of maturity who is his delight. Yet on the other hand, she says there's something more of Christ. It's a hope that every lover of Christ has, is to see him face to face and to be like him. And this is Christ is in us as the hope of glory. We're just pilgrims living on this earth. We do not belong to this world. And as we love Christ and pursue Christ, more and more the world is left behind. And it's like Enoch. Remember, he walked day after day, year after year with God. He pleased God. He walked with him for his pleasure. And then one day, Enoch was gone. God took him into a full and eternal enjoyment of himself. And this is the longing that we have, that the bride has. The bride is anticipating all that God has prepared for those who love him. So our prayer is, Lord Jesus, we want more of you. We love you. We desire you. Just be more real to us today and every day.